Welcome everyone to the Lofi Poli Sci podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pickering. That's right. Low fives and low fidelity, low quality, in your face, messy as can be global news show. And here we're going to talk about our famous question: what's going on in the world today? And today we have a special guest to talk about a special topic. I couldn't be happier to welcome back to the show Dr. Robert Worth, political scientist and professor at the University of New Orleans. Dr. Worth, how are you doing, my friend?
I'd say I'm doing pretty good, as is usually the case. We've got to add the caveat of pandemic stuff notwithstanding, but it's really good to be back on campus here at the University of New Orleans. Good to see all the students back at the semester working hard, doing their thing. So, yeah, I'd say I'm doing pretty good.
Lovely to hear. Yes, I always love the beginning of the semester. August for me feels like January, really. People do like New Year's resolutions in January, which they're always going to break. But then, like, it's the beginning of the year, and I'm like, no, 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 no. August, that's when everything starts.
I like it because you're right. For the academic world, it is a new beginning every August. So, it's a good way of looking at it.
Right, right. Yes, I love August, except for that New Orleans heat. But we could talk about that forever. But instead, what are we really here to talk about today, Dr. Worth?
Afghanistan.
Ooh, Afghanistan. So much going on with them. I mean, really, that for the podcast, it's been a little bit difficult to find international news that isn't about Afghanistan. But because of it, let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's get everything out there so people know really what's going on. And if you don't mind, could you give us a little bit of a background, maybe like from the 1990s moving forward? What was the situation of the government like in Afghanistan in the 1990s?
Sure. Well, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan. In 1991, the Soviet Union, of course, collapsed. The vacuum that the Soviets left was filled by the Mujahideen, who were guerrilla fighters that were opposed to the Soviet sort of puppet government, if you want to call it that. They assumed control of the country, but they never really quite organized themselves into an effective government. There's lots of infighting, there was no real unity, power grab here, power grab there, so on and so forth. The Taliban stepped into that subsequent vacuum. They began in the north of Afghanistan in the early 90s. By 1995, they had taken Kabul. By 1998, they basically controlled the entire country. And the elephant in the room, they were also giving sanctuary to Al Qaeda.
All right, so by the late 1990s, the Taliban were the Afghan government. They were one and the same, right? No difference.
Exactly.
And they were giving safety to terrorist group Al Qaeda. And that's going to be interesting because next question for you. Well, what changed? The Taliban was running the government of Afghanistan. What happened?
Yeah, exactly. For years, certainly I think it would be fair to call the Taliban government an international pariah, but nobody was really doing anything to effectively oppose them, much less invade and oust them. And then 9/11 happens, and that changed everything. And that's the genesis of what we're seeing in Afghanistan now, almost 20 years later. Because, right, like you said, they were providing sanctuary to Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda was without question behind the 9/11 attacks. So the Bush administration went in, ousted, or I shouldn't say ousted, but basically defeated Al Qaeda, drove them to the hills, drove bin Laden to Pakistan, and so on and so forth.
Right, right. And in the process of that, they got rid of Al Qaeda, or at least large portions of it, and they also removed the Taliban from power. And U.S. forces invaded, and in a couple years later, and almost around the same time, the events of invading Iraq also happened. But we're not going to talk about that in this context. But the U.S. goes in, ousts Al Qaeda, ousts the Taliban, and sets up a democratic government. So that was 2001. But now let's fast forward, Dr. Worth, bring us up to like the last 2, 3 years on to today. What's really been happening, and what happened 2 years ago that really got us down this track.
Yeah, so like you say, fast forward almost 20 years in this instance. Trump is the president. He didn't run on a platform of getting us out of Afghanistan, but he certainly frequently voiced a promise to do so. And in what I think it's fair to call true Trump fashion, he negotiated a deal of sorts with the Taliban that it's not real clear to me what that deal even was, other than we would withdraw by May 2021 in exchange for the Taliban, near as I can tell, basically not meddling with our withdrawal and tellingly, the Afghan government at the time was not a party to this deal. So the Afghan government is still at war with the Taliban. We're going to be leaving them behind. We strike our own kind of quasi deal with a promise to get out by May 2021.
All right, so that brings us almost up to today. Of course, we have the events of the 2020 election, and President Trump, he made the agreement with the Taliban, but he does not win the election. Enter the picture President Biden. President Biden decides he will honor the agreement, although it gets extended from May 2021 to August 2021. But Biden decides to honor that agreement and to withdraw Afghan forces.
Yeah, exactly. So Biden says, and whether he frames it as honoring the agreement or just doing what we needed to do in the first place, who can even say? But right, he makes plans for us to withdraw from Afghanistan. We do, in fact, withdraw, and things went in a direction that I don't think anyone anticipated. There was a lot of debate, certainly within our government, as to how things are going to unfold once we do withdraw. You're getting one intelligence estimate from the military, another from the intelligence services, so on and so forth. But I think it's fair to say I don't think anyone expected things to unfold quite the way they did.
Right. I mean, everyone knew that the Taliban was strong. I mean, that's the reason why they never truly disappeared over the past 20 years. The US may have invaded in 2001 and taken the Taliban out of power, but the Taliban never disappeared. And I think that's a very important aspect to remember about it, that they were somewhere in Afghanistan, and there's also a Pakistani Taliban as well. So they're multinational, but then the US start to withdraw and the Taliban just run into the country and start taking over provincial capital after provincial capital. But then, 2 weeks ago, we were hearing reports that the US was doing airstrikes along with the Afghani government against the Taliban to slow down the progression towards the capital. What do we really know about those airstrikes and what were they doing and where were they at, Dr. Worth?
It's a fair question to which I'll be the first to admit that I don't really have a precise answer, but I think that kind of highlights the nature of our withdrawal in general: chaotic, unclear, disorganized, and very clearly ineffective, which is really remarkable because Biden made the point in his speech, I think that was Monday, addressing all of this. So the Afghan government has an air force, right? We built them an air force. The Taliban most decidedly does not. The Afghan security forces, if you combine military and police, about 350,000 members. We spent about $80 billion on these security forces over 20 years. Last estimate I saw, the Taliban had about 70,000 fighters. This should have been, at best, a slow defeat to the Afghan security forces, or I shouldn't say at best, sorry, at worst, a slow defeat. And at best, they were able to hold the proverbial line, at least in Kabul, because as we know, the Taliban was the de facto government in much of the hinterlands of Afghanistan. And then, literally a few days later, the government flees, the Taliban takes Kabul. It's just not something anybody, I think, saw coming. It's just really dumbfounding.
And you make a great point about the Air Force. I mean, regardless about the 350,000 troops versus 70,000 troops, but the Air Force, there was reportedly over 200 fighter jets and bombers that the Afghan Air Force had. Where did those planes go? Like, do we know?
It's certainly not a question I know the answer to, but I feel like we can pretty safely assume that the planes and really the rest of the military equipment that we provided the Afghan government with, presumably that's in the hands of the Taliban now.
Right, right. And I did read one report that somewhere around like 25 to 45 helicopters, military helicopters, and military planes, they defected the Afghan Air Force and they went to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. But still, we're not quite sure about that. And even if it is that many, still, you have another 200 to account for. And what about all the tanks we provided, the artillery that we provided? And like you said, theoretically, one would think now all of that is in the hands of the Taliban. And those 350,000 fighters, where are they? The police, the army, the Air Force. I mean, we know the president and the vice president of Afghanistan have gone into self-imposed exile, which for listeners out there, you may see in the movies someone going into exile. And it sounds like something really from a movie about warlords and things like that. It doesn't sound real, but it most certainly is. And Dr. Worth, what do we know about the president and vice president leaving the country?
Well, they, I think it's fair to say, fled the country pretty early on, and this is such a compressed time frame. The time frame from the Taliban taking these provincial capitals to literally just walking into Kabul, meeting basically no resistance. It all happened so quick. Reports are out today that the president ended up in the United Arab Emirates, and they've confirmed that and said that they're giving him, I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, but humanitarian sort of harbor, if you want to phrase it that way. And right, it would be one thing for, let's say that there was one intelligence report out of the US government saying it'll be about 18 months, but the Taliban's probably going to end up, winning and taking control of the country. It would be one thing had this been a much slower unwinding of this thing. But right, to see a head of state, I don't know if he literally fled in the middle of the night, but it had that quality to it, right? Fleeing at the last minute under a circumstance no one anticipated and now living in exile. It's just not something anyone anticipated, not to keep repeating that over and over. And you make the really good point about, right, what happened to these 350,000 members of the security forces? Did they just put their guns down and they're bleeding back into society? Perhaps, but what's going to happen to these people? Will they be able to find new employment? Will they join the Taliban either because it seems like their best opportunity, or will they do so to avoid reprisal? Will the Taliban engage in mass reprisals? These are questions that at this point, nobody really has an answer to, but they're also questions I don't think anybody expected to need to have an answer to this week or this month or next month or the month after that.
Well, let's go ahead and jump into some of that talk and talking about the future. I mean, we know where we were, we know where we are. Now let's talk about where we're going. So you're right, those 350,000 soldiers, we know some of them fled to other countries. All right, but still, the reports are it wasn't nearly 350,000. So the vast majority of them are still in Afghanistan. Do they join the Taliban? And by doing so, shore up and strengthen the Taliban as the government, basically combine forces and make a even stronger Afghanistan military. And these are the individuals that have the training to use all the military equipment that was provided by the US government. But the thing is, no matter what the answer to that one is, the Taliban's in power. Now, what kind of Taliban are we going to see? You brought up the point that the Taliban, they have said they are not going to go on a revenge spree against people. They've also said that they are going to be inclusive to women in politics and that they are going to respect women's rights, in particular in the capital as well. Do we buy this, Dr. Worth?
Yeah, I think that's the question on everyone's minds. And the easy pessimistic view is to just sort of dismiss these promises from the Taliban and say, yeah, but we saw what you were doing 25 years ago. You claim that you're a different sort of entity now. Sure. On the more optimistic side, like you said, particularly in the capital, 20 years of relative security, relatively liberal society. I don't think it would look that way to you or I, but compared to what the people have been living with under the Taliban, it's an open question if maybe if for no other reason than simple pragmatism, they won't be nearly as regressive and, oppressive and really frankly horrifying to the rest of the world. Who knows what their actual goal is, but it could be that pragmatically they step back and they say, okay, at least in the capital, the game has changed. We can only go so far. And then out in the provinces and the hinterlands, probably a very different situation, but that's not really different from what they had been doing out there for the last 10 odd years anyway. So personally, I want to grasp for optimism, and it's not real easy to come by, but it could be that Afghani society, at least in the capital, has changed in a liberal direction such that the Taliban has to moderate itself.
Yeah, especially in the sense that they are urging people to go back to work. And in the capital specifically, women are a large part of the economy. And if you're a new government and you want your economy to keep going, you want a peaceful transition as far as economically speaking, if suddenly you take the women out of the economy, you are going to hurt your country's progression, your transition. So in a cost benefit analysis, and I'm not trying to frame it as this is the way they should look at it or anyone should look at it. But if the Taliban are going to use a cost benefit analysis, it would be in their benefit, economically speaking, to allow women to have political and economic rights. That way, their economy can still keep moving forward. But I am hopeful like you are. However, at the same time, I have a lot of reservations. I am not of the mind that the Taliban owes allegiance to anyone, nor do I think the Taliban feels like they have to keep agreements. Just because they say one thing, they don't have to do it. Because the question then to you I want to pose, Dr. Worth, is if the Taliban say, we will give women their political rights and be more inclusive, but in 2 weeks, in a month, all of that disappears and they go back to the Taliban of the 1990s. Is the international community going to do anything about it?
Yeah, that's the question. And here too, I want to share your optimism that obviously, hopefully, we don't even confront that circumstance. But if we do, it's a very good question because the United States, to say that we have Afghanistan fatigue would be an overstatement, right? Getting out of Afghanistan was broadly popular, even if the way that it happened was not. The international community, it's an open question how willing they would be to act. And it's telling that the Taliban claim to want legitimacy, right? They claim to want to be recognized as the legitimate government of Afghanistan and to be recognized as a legitimate member of the international community. Some countries, Canada, came out, I think, yesterday and said that Canada will not recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, period. The United States, on the other hand, gave a kind of evasive response to that question and said, I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but we'll have to wait and see, right? We'll have to wait and see what they do. So we're not taking the possibility of recognizing them as the government of Afghanistan off the table. Is that recognition and legitimacy within the international community enough to convince them to behave in a more liberal fashion? It's an open question. I certainly hope so. Should it become, like you say, the Taliban of the 1990s? I don't personally have a lot of optimism that the international community would do much. After 20 years of the US and to an extent its NATO allies trying to build a democratic society in Afghanistan, fatigue, and again, optimism. Here's hoping we don't even get to that point. But on that issue, I find it a little bit more difficult to find the optimistic angle.
I can definitely see why that is. And I'll go ahead and say, and throw it out there, like, although I am optimistic, if we do get it to that point and the Taliban decides to reverse women's political rights and economic freedoms, and civil liberties and civil rights are just thrown away. I do not see the West doing anything about it. Considering the state of the international community at the moment, even regardless of the pandemic, the European Union is just getting through Brexit, but it's still not completely solved. So the EU has a lot going on. Plus, Poland and Hungary are major internal democratic backsliding issues for the European Union. They're dealing with their own issues, much less, have to worry about democracy promotion abroad. The US has a lot of domestic issues and fatigue from the Afghanistan war. I kind of am hesitant to see democracy promotion to really be a big thing moving forward. Not to mention, Russia didn't even close their embassy in Afghanistan during all this. China has already stated that they are more than willing to work with the Taliban. Even if the West comes out and says, we're not working with the Taliban, they have ample trading partners in their own region to be quite well and good as far as economic and diplomatic survival goes. So I am hopeful, but I am not optimistic that the West is going to do anything if the situation gets worse. That's just
I share that view. Yeah. And like you said, 20 years ago, China wouldn't have been able to exert anywhere even remotely near the leverage that they will be able to exert now in terms of investing in Afghanistan, in terms of supporting the Taliban, assuming that they go on to, be the long-term government. And so, right, the region is very, very different. And I think we can all safely assume that China will gladly take the opportunity to expand into Afghanistan. And if you juxtapose that with and I agree, the West in general just kind of want to be done with it, yeah, it's not speculation to see China kind of stepping in as we step out. And we know China's record on human rights within their own country. It's hard to imagine that they would be particularly concerned with oppressive rule from the Taliban, so long as the Taliban worked with them as a partner.
precisely. And I mean, if you look at the entire region, so if we bring in Freedom House, and for listeners who aren't sure what Freedom House is a non-governmental organization that ranks countries by their civil liberties and civil rights. They use a scale from 0 to 100 to see how free every country is in the world. And Central Asia and the Middle East as a region are the least free and least democratic region in the world. I don't think Afghanistan, even being led by the Taliban, are going to find it hard to find international actors in their region willing to do business diplomatically and economically with them. And then the West is going to have to face a choice. As the international economy opens back up more and more from the pandemic, it's already started doing so. But as it opens up more and more and more, are they going to add another country to the list of people they do not do business with? North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba. Are they going to add Afghanistan to that list now? That's something they will have to decide. And you said Canada has already come out and said, no. The US is kind of like, I'm not sure. The EU, I read a couple of days ago that they said they may not want to acknowledge the Taliban, but they do understand that they will have to meet with them, which kind of signals to me that the EU is looking forward like they might be willing to do business with them. What do you think about that?
I think that that's exactly the situation. The US and the EU, right, as near as we can tell at this very early point, might be willing to do business diplomatically and otherwise. And I think the wait and see approach is warranted. But what concerns me, and this is more or less just a reiteration of what we both said, but if the US and the EU is willing to do business with the Taliban, it will be under conditions, right? It will be if the Taliban does A, B, and C and doesn't do X, Y, and Z. Whereas it's very difficult to see Russia and especially China attaching the same conditions to this proverbial doing business. And given the option of the two, again, I just don't see much engagement between us and the Taliban, because what do we really have to offer that China and Russia don't have to offer, whereas China and Russia have plenty to offer that we can't offer, namely looking the other way on human rights. So, yet again, that leaves me pessimistic as well.
Well, I have one final question for you that really kind of ties into exactly what you're saying here, and that's the idea of, what does the Taliban have that the U.S. Wants, or what does the U.S. have that the Taliban would want? And as far as what does the U.S. have, we have a huge consumer market that the Taliban and Afghanistan government would want access to. They would want that U.S. consumers buy goods from Afghanistan. It would help out their economy. On the flip side, what does Afghanistan have that the US wants? Right now, there's somewhere around 20,000 Afghanistan people that are waiting to come to the United States. How do you see this playing out? Do you think that the US is going to be successful at really evacuating these 20,000 people now that the Taliban control the entire country?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic in terms of being able to just logistically get maybe not all of these people out, but we've been doing a reasonably good job of it, in my opinion, given the circumstances, right? Now, that's not to say we shouldn't have done a better job 1 week ago and 2 weeks ago and all of that. By no means am I giving us a pass on this. But based on the news I've been reading today, so far the Taliban is kind of staying back and letting us get people out. Will that continue? Yet again, who knows? My bigger concern is, do we have the political will to follow through and get all of these people out and resettle them in the United States? Because as we know, neither we nor any other country on the planet really has ever come close to living up to our obligations to refugees and migrants under international law. And then you throw something like this into the mix, it's more our political will that concerns me. But again, given the very unique circumstances that these people face, in the sense that they helped us, that's why they're now in danger and need to leave. Maybe politically at home, that plays a little bit differently than, say, someone fleeing the Syrian civil war, as an example. I certainly hope so, but we'll see.
Yes, I think I agree with you on both points. I think the political will in the United States, both in DC, Washington, DC, as well as among the citizens, is there to help these 20,000 people. Will resettling them be difficult? Yes. But I think the will to evacuate them is there. And I think it's in the Taliban's best interest to allow the United States and other Western countries to evacuate Afghan citizens that wish to leave. Because if the Taliban allow this to take place, it earns them at least a smidgen of goodwill, or at the very least, not as much bad will, or not as much ill will, for everything that's gone on. So I am more hopeful about these 20,000 individuals being evacuated than I am for almost anything else in the situation.
That's a very good point, because I completely agree. What does that Taliban stand to gain by stopping these evacuations? It's not clear to me what that would really be. What do they stand to gain by allowing them to proceed? Right, you articulated that perfectly. So I agree that, yeah, maybe some optimism is warranted in this particular case.
Yes, indeed. There's just so much going on, and so quickly is everything developing. But Dr. Worth, let me just say thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about everything going on in Afghanistan. It seems like everything is so muddled, so difficult to really see in media today, what's happening versus what's going to happen. And you've truly put some much needed perspective on that. So thank you again so much. And please do come back to us and see us soon, my friend.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on as always. And here's hoping that next time, for one thing, we're talking about something that we can be a little bit more optimistic about. And I couldn't agree more about the muddle and the difficulty in having this conversation with you. I don't know about you, but I wish that I could speak a little bit more decisively and conclusively and make stronger arguments about what I think is going to happen. But at this early juncture, it's just, not to make light, it's just such a mess. It doesn't really seem to do justice to the humanitarian catastrophe that it's a challenge, but I'll look forward to talking about this political stuff with you again soon.
Definitely. We most certainly will. And thank you one last time, and we'll talk very, very soon. And that's just a brief snapshot of what's going on in Afghanistan today. Come back tomorrow for a little more lighthearted topics with Good News Friday. That's right, we can't be all doom and gloom every day. Always remember that Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Peace and well-being to all my human beings out there. Much love and always the best. Worth and Pickering, signing off.